Okay, so welcome to this next video in which we are discussing hemostasis. Okay, right, so we have so far discussed two of the components of hemostasis. So hemostasis, remember, is the process by which you stop hemorrhage. So we're imagining we've got a cut in the side of one of our arterioles which is leaking blood out of the side of it. And what we want to do is stop that hemorrhage, stop that blood from leaving the blood vessel. Okay, now one of the first response is to constrict the blood vessel so that less blood gets to this affected region and less blood therefore can leave through this cut. Okay, the second response was to form a primary hemostatic plug, so to have platelet aggregation. Okay, and we've now seen how the formation of this cut is going to activate platelet aggregation, and this will form what's known as a primary hemostatic plug or a primary platelet plug, which is this mass of platelets which is just blocking the gap now in the wall of the blood vessel. Okay, now what we're going to discuss is the final process, which is a process known as coagulation. Okay, and coagulation is the process by which you can take components of the blood. Okay, so take proteins which are within the blood and create fibrin strands, create these huge, great strands known as fibrin strands, which are going to intertwine amongst the platelets and create a meshwork which is holding the platelets together. And this is going to transform our primary hemostatic plug to what's known as a secondary hemostatic plug. And secondary hemostatic plugs are far stronger. So this one is very sort of gooey and mushy, and it's just loads of cells, sort of squishy little things all attached to one another by quite weak interactions. What you're now going to produce is a great spider's web, basically, that's going to intertwine into every little crevice and just hold the whole thing together. And this is far stronger, basically. So we are now going to discuss coagulation, which is the process of producing these fibrin strands, which is going to turn the primary hemostatic plug into a secondary hemostatic plug. Okay, and there are two main mechanisms by which you can get coagulation. And I'm sorry, I have reduced to using the British English spelling of heme rather than the American English spelling. I just can't help it. This is the one I've been using for 10 years or whatever. Sorry about that. But just if you are an American, or if you use the American English spelling, just take the A out, basically. I think most of the world uses the American English spelling. Right, okay, so coagulation then. Let's begin with the intrinsic coagulation pathway. Okay, so let's start. So the intrinsic coagulation pathway is activated again by exposed collagen. So we've seen that platelet activation is initiated by collagen. Now what we're going to see is that the initial thing which starts off the coagulation cascade is also set off by collagen, at least the thing that triggers the intrinsic coagulation cascade, and there are two coagulation cascades. So before we start on the actual cascade itself, let me tell you where we're going. So let me tell you what coagulation actually is. Okay, so we'll talk about coagulation. So coagulation is the conversion of a protein known as fibrinogen, which we've already seen. Okay, so here is fibrinogen, this bilobed protein here, which we know is factor 1, basically, is another old name for fibrinogen. So fibrinogen or factor 1, whichever name you want to use. Basically, this is an inert protein. This is not doing anything. It's a usual protein which is within all of our blood, hopefully, and it's not doing anything. However, in coagulation, what you do is you convert it into a different protein, okay? You convert it into, you don't convert it into a different protein. You convert it into an active form known as fibrin, and this is also referred to as factor 1A. So you put a little A down there to denote that it's activated. Okay, so fibrin or factor 1A, this is the active form of factor 1. Now, what happens to the activated form of factor 1? Well, basically, it is sewn together, basically. It's polymerized together. So you take this single little protein and then you polymerize it together to make great long strands. And these are fibrin strands. And the enzyme which catalyzes this polymerization of the fibrin, the activated fibrin, is an enzyme known as factor 13A. Okay, so here is factor 13A, so that's 11, 12, 13A. Right, so basically, coagulation is the process of taking the inert protein fibrinogen, activating it to fibrin, or factor 1A, and then polymerizing this together to make fibrin strands, which are macroscopic strands. These are big strands which are going to form a fibrin meshwork that's going to surround the platelets of the primary hemostatic plug and make that structure far stronger and convert it into a secondary platelet plug or a secondary hemostatic plug. Okay, right, so that's coagulation. So how are we actually going to activate this conversion of the inactive protein into the active protein? Well, basically, it all begins with the activation of a factor known as factor 12. Okay, so, just like the platelet activation process, factor 12 is activated by exposure to collagen. So again, it's activated by the by exactly what happens when you cut the blood vessel. So when you cut the blood vessel, blood is going to seep out of the blood vessel, and it's now going to go and meet loads of new proteins that it was never allowed to see before. So for instance, here we have the basement membrane, and then below the basement membrane, we know that we've got the subendothelial space, or the subendothelial connective tissue here. Okay, and they're far better when I sort of use the flat end rather than the tip, because the tip is the dirty bit. Okay, so what's going to happen is that factor 12 is going to come and meet this collagen, okay? And when it meets that collagen, it's going to become activated. So, you start off with a protein known as factor 12, which I'll just denote as 12 now because it will get too tiring writing factor all the time, because we're going to see a lot of clotting factors. Okay, so factor 12 has another name. It's also known by the name Hageman factor. Okay, so you may well hear factor 12 referred to as Hageman factor. Now, factor 12 or Hageman factor is a usual constituent of the blood. It's just like fibrinogen. When there's no cut, it's perfectly happy. It's an inactive protein. It's going around in the blood and doing nothing. When all it's exposed to is the apical surfaces of endothelial cells, it does nothing. However, when there is a cut, it's going to now be exposed to totally new things. It's got this whole new repertoire of proteins to meet. So it's going to go off and meet collagen, basically. And collagen causes a conformational change in the protein. It causes it to convert into what's known as factor 12A. So it activates factor 12. Okay, so this is collagen's doing that does this. Okay, and it's only ever going to see factor 12, it's only ever going to see collagen when you've got some sort of a cut in the side of the arteriole. So this is also called activated Hageman factor. Okay, or activated factor 12. Right, now what does factor 12 do once it's been activated? Well, basically it starts off a whole coagulation cascade, and this is why the coagulation cascade is known as a coagulation cascade, because it just activates a whole bunch of other proteins. So it now activates another clotting factor. So there is another protein which is within the blood. Again, it's a normal component of the blood, and it's known as factor 11. Okay, so factor 11 is a normal constituent of the blood. However, when factor 12 becomes activated, what it will now do is it will start activating factor 11. So it will change factor 11 to factor 11A. So factor 11 will become activated. Now, what does factor 11 do? Well, it activates another coagulation factor. So another coagulation factor is factor 9. Again, this is a normal component of the blood. Initially, it's inactive, but when factor 11 becomes active, what it's going to do is it's going to activate factor 9. So factor 9 is going to be converted to factor 9A. Okay, now, what is factor 9 going to do? What is factor 9A going to do? Okay, so basically, factor 9A activates factor 10, so it activates another one, but there's also a cofactor for this enzyme. So you also need factor 8A here, okay? So you've got some factor 8A here, and factor 8 will bind to factor 11A, okay? And then together they will convert factor, let's do it this way, factor 10 to factor 10A. So let me say this again. So factor 8A is a cofactor for factor 9A basically. So 9A is the main enzyme which is going to do this activation of factor 10. However, it needs factor 8A to bind to it in order for it to then catalyze this process of 10 being converted to 10A. Okay, you might ask, well, where does factor 8A come from? Now, factor 8A is going to be activated by something far further down this pathway. So basically, there's going to always be a little bit of factor 8A available, but what you're going to do is amplify it up, and I'll discuss that more in a moment. So for now, just believe that there will be a tiny bit of factor 8A available for the factor 9A to work alongside with. So once you've activated the factor 9A, now it will be able to bind with this little bit of 8A that's available, and then that will be able to convert 10 to 10A. Okay, so now, what will 10A do? Well, it's going to work in a very similar way to 9A. So again, it needs another cofactor to come in. So it needs a cofactor known as factor 5A. And together, factor 10A with factor 5A bound to it will activate factor 2 into factor 2A. Okay, so factor 2 is going to go to 2A. Now, factor 2 is not often referred to as factor 2. Instead, factor 2 is more often known as prothrombin. Okay? Prothrombin. And then factor 2A is then referred to as thrombin. So these names are more commonplace for these two factors. So clotting factor 2 is prothrombin. When it's activated, you call it then thrombin. But you can, if you wish, use factor 2 and factor 2A. It's always, because people always ask, you know, what is factor 1 and factor 2? Why do they not exist? Why have we got all these other coagulation factors, but they're not the first and the second one? And it's because the first and the second one are so important that they've been given better names, basically. So you don't use the names 1 and 2 anymore. Okay, so factor 1 is fibrinogen, and factor 2 is prothrombin. Okay, right, so we'll continue this discussion in the next video.